Hello, everyone. In this last video lecture regarding the introduction to ICD-10 PCS, we'll wrap it up and walk through an example of how we code hospital-based procedures using ICD-10 PCS. And again, now we're getting into the seventh character, which is a qualifier. A qualifier is a character that just basically adds more information to describe the procedures. And there's several unique qualifiers that you can have depending on what the procedure is. It usually has a very narrow application to a specific root operation. And again, there are things like a destination site. When you have a bypass for a coronary artery bypass, you're bypassing a coronary artery from one site and then you have a destination site. So that's really what they're talking about with a qualifier. You also use them to identify the type of a transplant that's performed, whether it's allogenic, syngeneic, or zooplastic. And again, another one is a biopsy, because sometimes we can do biopsies to identify when a biopsy procedure is performed. And of course, just like ICD-10-CM, we have guidelines for ICD-10 PCS. They're developed by CMS and NCHS, and they're approved by the cooperating parties for ICD-10 PCS, includes the American Hospital Association, the American Health Information Management Association, CMS, and NCHS. Guidelines accompany and assist in the interpretation of how the official conventions and instructions within ICD-10 PCS are applied. Anything that's in the instructions and the conventions take precedence over the guidelines, just like an ICD-10 PCS. Adherence to the guidelines is required under HIPAA, as these codes are required for hospital and patient healthcare settings under HIPAA. Current guidelines are the 2026 edition, and these are updated yearly. They're included on the website, and you can also pull them off the CMS or the NCHS websites as well. The guidelines consist of 6 parts, including the convention, the medical surgical section guidelines, obstetric section guidelines, radiation therapy section guidelines, new technology section guidelines, and selections of principal procedures. And again, the official guidelines, I'm going to post them on Canvas for you so you have them ready. You may want to refer to them. Hopefully, we'll refer to them often in the next several weeks. And there's an overview in the chapters in the code books and the textbooks. So please refer to the textbook for review for that quick synopsis of the guidelines for each chapter. And again, added to these codes, we have some unique procedures that are requested via the new technology application process for Medicare. These are new devices, substances, and technology, including specialized drug infusions. There's a whole new technology group, which is a number or letter that can change every year as a new technology code is added to the system. And the seventh character is a unique code, a unique value every year when new codes are added. And guidelines for Section X, these are standalone codes. In other words, they do not require any additional codes from any other section of ICD-10 PCS. When Section X contains a code title that describes a specific new technology procedure, only that X code is reported for the procedure. When multiple procedures are coded or performed, new technology Section X codes are coded following the multiple procedures guideline. New technology codes are located by using the ICD-10 PCS index or tables. In the index, the name of the new technology device, substance, or technology for the X code section X code, excuse me, is included as a main term. Codes may also be listed in the index under the main term of new technology. So we had principal diagnoses in ICD-10-CM, and likewise, we have the principal procedure according to the guidelines. The selection of the principal procedure is in relation to the principal diagnosis when more than one procedure is performed. What does that mean? It means that we need to have a procedure performed for definitive treatment of both the principal diagnosis and the secondary diagnosis. And we sequence these procedures performed for definitive treatment that's most related to the principal diagnosis as the principal procedure. The procedure performed for definitive treatment and diagnostic procedure performed for both principal diagnosis and secondary diagnosis. You would sequence the procedure performed for definitive treatment most related to the principal diagnosis as the principal procedure. So there needs to be a relation. You can't have something totally different for principal procedure that has no relationship to the principal diagnosis. A diagnostic procedure that's performed for a principal diagnosis and a procedure that's performed for definitive treatment of a secondary diagnosis, we would sequence the diagnostic procedure as a principal since this procedure is most related to the principal procedure. No procedures that are performed that are related to a principal diagnosis, meaning procedures performed for definitive treatment and diagnostic procedures are performed for secondary diagnosis. You would sequence those procedures performed for definitive treatment of a secondary diagnosis as a principal procedure since there are no procedures related to the principal diagnosis. And again, we have a home page for ICD-10 PCS on the CMS Medicare website. We have the downloadable guidelines. Definitely would like you to take a look at that. Now we get to figure out how to assign an ICD-10 PCS code. So basically, we do it by assigning the values for each of the 7 characters. The main term in the index may be a root operation phrase, like a resection, comma gallbladder, or a common procedure, like a cholecystectomy. The purpose of the alphabetic index is to locate the appropriate tables so we can finish off the rest of the code. The PCS tables are always consulted for the most appropriate valid code. Something that's different about ICD-10 PCS as opposed to ICD-10 CM is you don't necessarily have to use the index before proceeding to the tables to construct the codes. And now here's some examples. So we have a laparoscopic total cholecystectomy. The coder may use the main term resection gallbladder. You may also use the term cholecystectomy. Both of them will direct you to the same table. So it'll direct you to table 0FT4, right? And then once we access that table, we finish off the rest of it. The remaining 4 characters are assigned basis on the choices that are given in that table. And this is where the row, staying in the same row comes in. So take your code books and look up this table here, the OFT table, and let's follow the rest of it. So if we did a cholecystectomy performed through a laparoscopic approach, it would be OFT44ZZ. And that's all I have for you. I hope you found this useful. Please reach out if you have any questions about ICD-10 PCS, this introduction in Chapter 3. That's all I have for you. Thanks for watching. Bye now.